It's now my enormous pleasure to welcome Emeritus Professor Stephen Schwartz to present our keynote dinner address, which has a most intriguing title: A Bored Billionaire, A Grieving Sister, and a Lump of Clay. Professor Schwartz served as Vice-Chancellor President of Macquarie University in Sydney. He was also Vice-Chancellor of Brunel University in London and Vice-Chancellor of Murdoch University in Perth. He has served as Executive Director of the Council for Humanities, Arts and Social Sciences and Chairman of the Board of the Australian Curriculum Assessment and Reporting Authority, ACARA. He was Chair of the Fulbright Commission, a Fellow of the Academy of Social Sciences, an Academy of Science Royal Society Exchange Fellow, and a NATO Fellow. Professor Schwartz is an Honorary Fellow of Balliol College, Oxford, and has authored 13 books, more than 120 scientific articles, and hundreds of newspaper and magazine articles. We are honoured to welcome Professor Schwartz this evening, who will share his wisdom with us. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much for that introduction. It's much more than I deserve. And to tell you the truth, it's a lot more than I'm used to. The day that Macquarie University announced my retirement, I was walking across campus and I came across quite a famous chemistry professor, and she looked agitated. She came up to me and she said, "I've just heard this news. You're retiring?" And I said, I want to reassure you, it's fine. The council of the university has appointed a selection committee. They're going to search far and wide, and I'm sure they'll find a terrific person to be the next vice-chancellor. And she said, "Oh, sure, that's what they said last time." I wasn't hurt. I'm used to it. You do get used to it in universities, and I did. Now, some people tell me that I speak with an accent, and if I do, there is an explanation. I came to Australia from Texas in 1978, and Texas has always been a kind of unusual state. For one thing, it was the only state that was actually its own country for a while, but it's also known for some pretty zany politicians. George Bush and the other George Bush, they were Texans, but the politician I wanted to tell you about is called Ferguson, and he was governor, but he had the misfortune to die in office. And his wife, whose name was Margaret, but who everyone in Texas knew as Ma Ferguson, she decided that she would run for his office, and she did, and she won, and she became governor of Texas. And at the time that Ma Ferguson was governor, the Texas state legislature was debating the thorny issue of how do you educate the kids, the children of Mexican migrants? Do you teach them in their native language of Spanish, or do you teach them in English, or some combination of the two? That's probably still being debated. It's one of those perennial issues. But at the time, Ma Ferguson thought she knew the answer. She stood up in the Texas state legislature and she caught the speaker's eye and she said, "Mr. Speaker, it's obvious that these children should be taught in English." And she then reached down in front of her and she picked up the Holy Bible that sits in front of every member of the Texas state legislature. And she picked it up, she pointed to it, and she said, "After all, Mr. Speaker, if English was good enough for Jesus Christ, English should be good enough for them." It's a true story, folks. Now, let's hope that I think it's pretty obvious that Ma Ferguson was not the beneficiary of a Ramsay Center scholarship. But one can hope that at some time in the future, as she got older, she did have the opportunity perhaps to learn more about history and more about the world. Many people do. One of the experiences you have when you're a vice-chancellor is you go to lots and lots of graduations. And a feature of every graduation, and I know there are people sitting here who will know, there's always a queue of students of a certain mature age who are there to collect their PhDs. And the stories are always very similar amongst them, that after a career spent in maybe business or politics or government or public service somewhere, they retired and they've come back to university to fulfill their lifelong desire to study architecture in ancient Rome, or to steep themselves in poetry, or to maybe write a novel. In all the graduation ceremonies I've been to, and I've been to a lot of them, I never met anyone who came back to university in order to fulfill a passion to study accounting or marketing or business administration. So it seems to me that when working life begins to wane and it becomes time to fill the soul, to feed the soul, that the only thing that provides the proper nutrition is the humanities. But despite commanding so much loyalty and so much enthusiasm, the humanities are sort of perennially in crisis, and academics in the humanities often feel undervalued. Nowadays, they worry about being tossed overboard as leaky finances force universities to jettison courses and just to keep afloat. And you can see it all around you. Language departments have largely disappeared in most universities. Classics and philosophy are finding it hard to keep going. History's still around, but nothing sacrosanct. The previous government, you must know, doubled the cost of a humanities degree, claiming that only, quote, job-ready, unquote, subjects like nursing or engineering, only those deserve to be subsidized by the government. Students who wish to waste their time on frivolous pursuits, such as the humanities, can just pay the costs themselves. Now, I know it's stingy, but it fits our times, because instead of using our money to buy the best education our money could buy, what we're now looking for is an education that will bring in the most money. Now, don't get me wrong, I'm not against money. I'm not against getting rich, and I'm not against capitalism. I agree with the legendary screen siren Mae West, who in one of her movies once said, "I've been rich and I've been poor, and believe me, baby, rich is better." And I'm sure she's right about that. Our vicar, when we ever used to say, "Why does the church always asking for money?" And the vicar would say, "No margin, no mission." You can't do anything without money. But first, you got to have a mission, don't you? And it's hard to understand from modern universities what the exact mission might be. We know what the traditional mission was: preserving the culture, extending knowledge, building character. But nowadays, when you look at the newspapers especially to see what it is university PR departments are working on, it's usually an economic impact study. So the group of 8 research-intensive universities have said that last year they contributed $66.4 billion to the gross domestic product. Right? Truth, beauty, love, wit, kindness, courage, that ain't in there. They're not even mentioned. It's all about the money. And yet, when it comes time for any of us, for you, for me, for any of us, to sum up our lives, those other things, courage, wit, move, those are the only things people care about. They never care about anything else. And I know it's been said before, and better than I do, but we seem to know the price of everything and the value of nothing. So in this talk, what I'd like to do is to demonstrate what I believe is the true value of the humanities and the true value of Western civilization humanities. And it's not how much money they make, that's the takeaway point, right? It's how much they contribute to human flourishing. Now, I realize that many of you here today are not studying in the humanities. You've got doctors and lawyers and others, scientists, and you might be wondering whether this is really relevant to you. Well, I was once a dean of medicine, and I can assure you that knowing the history of medicine does not make it any easier to take out a gallbladder. So from a practical point of view, you're probably right. But studying the humanities could help you determine whether it's a good idea to operate on this patient, and how the patient might feel, and how the family might feel, and whether people should be treated or not treated. There is a lot more to learn, and I think the humanities are there to teach it. Now, I'm going to use 3 different stories. and you've heard them in the title. First one is about A Bored Billionaire, and the second one's about a grieving sister, and the third one is about a lump of clay. And I can see by your faces you're already dubious. What is this guy on about? Well, trust me, it'll all become clear, I hope. Anyway, let me tell you the first story. It dates back to when I was Vice Chancellor of Macquarie University. We got a phone call from Seattle, Washington, and the person on the phone claimed to be Bill Gates. Now, those of you who work in university know that we do get the occasional crank calling a university, and I thought this was one of those, but my curiosity got the better of me, so I took the call, and I'm glad I did because it was Bill Gates, the Bill Gates calling. It transpires, and this is what I've learned, that Bill Gates gets his exercise in the morning by walking on a treadmill, but he finds it very boring. So he hooked up the treadmill to the internet so he could surf the net while he got his exercise, and that's how he discovered a set of videos created by a professor at Macquarie University, a professor of history, called David Christian. Now, David Christian is the pioneer of an area called big history. Big history is everything from the Big Bang creation of the universe till 2 o'clock yesterday afternoon, right? So it's about 13.7 billion years. And you can imagine, with a time span like that to cover, David's not got much time for trifles. He deals with the really big issues: the creation of the universe, evolution, the cultural development, the rise of religion, modern economics, and so on. And Gates said that big history, these videos, were the best videos he'd ever seen for higher education, and he wanted to meet David and fly him out to Seattle, which he did. And while David was in Seattle, they developed a research program to extend big history into high schools. Gates then arranged for David to give a talk at the legendary TED conference in California, and then he put him on a plane and took him to Davos, where David talked to heads of state and to leaders of multinational corporations. And as a result of this, big history began to spread around the world, and it's influenced the school curriculum here in Australia, as well as universities, but also in the US, the UK, Canada, Ireland, and many other countries as well. Now, for those of you who count the money, if this is going to be an economic impact study, big history does contribute to the GDP through the sale of books and course materials and videos. They have conferences. People come to rooms like this and spend money on food. I mean, they do make money, but that's got nothing to do with the value of big history. Big history helps students to appreciate that complex interaction, that most complex interaction between the physical world and the cultural world, between social forces and physical forces. And these are the things that have given rise to our civilization. They've brought us to where we are today, and they will determine where we go tomorrow. So there's a big lesson to be learned there. Students who studied big history tend to study history. They are enthused enough to study history, but a large number of them are enthused to study science because of the interaction between the physical and the forces. So these are good things. And I have to say, big history, the whole incident taught me a lesson as well, which I thought was very useful career advice for a university administrator. And that is, if Bill Gates calls, be sure to answer the phone. Yeah. Now, I'll tell you my second story. This takes place in the late 1960s. A group of inmates at South Africa's notorious Robben Island prison decide to stage a performance of Sophocles' 2,000-year-old tragedy, Antigone. One prisoner who had no acting experience or stage experience but was keen to participate was named Nelson Mandela. And in his autobiography, Long Walk to Freedom, Mandela describes his role as King Creon in Antigone. And I'll just read what he has to say. This is Mandela's words. At the outset, Creon is sincere and patriotic. And there's wisdom in his early speeches when he suggests that experience is the foundation of leadership and that obligations to the people take precedence over loyalty to any particular individual. But Creon deals with his enemies mercilessly. he's decreed that the body of Antigone's brother, who had rebelled against the city, will not get and does not deserve a proper burial. Antigone, who is grieving for her brother, rebels on the grounds that there is a higher law than the law of the state. But Creon won't listen to Antigone. He won't listen to anyone. He only listens to his inner demons. And Mandela finishes by saying, Antigone symbolized our struggle. She was, in her own way, a freedom fighter, for she defied the law on the grounds that it was unjust. Now, a few years after that performance in prison, the South African playwright, director, and actor, Athol Fugard, created a play which was based on the prison play of Antigone, and he called it The Island. And Fugard's play was specifically designed to illustrate the parallels between Antigone's situation and Mandela's struggle against a despotic and oppressive regime. Ironically, South Africa's apartheid law forbid the biracial troupe of actors that Fugard had put together from actually performing at the same time on the same stage. And so the play debuted in London, and then it was performed in New York, and then it moved to cities all around the world. Audiences who came to this play were horrified by the whole concept and cruelties that were associated with apartheid. And they encouraged their respective governments, where they are able to bring sanctions against the South African regime. And in his autobiography, Mandela attributes the defeat of apartheid, in part, at least, to the political activism that was encouraged and pushed on by Fugard's play. So The Island, he said, was helpful in getting rid of apartheid. And the curious thing is, this was not the only time that Sophocles' 2,000-year-old play mobilized modern audiences to fight for political change. It was one of many. For example, I should back up and say, one of the reasons why Antigone was used in this way is that the oppositions that are depicted in the play, young versus old, powerful versus powerless, divine laws versus human laws, they have very wide applicability in many different situations. So in 1944, for example, the Nazis had occupied France, and the legendary French dramatist Jean Anouilh produced a version of Antigone in which the struggle between Creon and his niece really served as a symbol between the struggle of the freedom fighters in France and their German conquerors. And the play was a very effective recruitment tool for the resistance. A little bit later, in the 1980s, when Poland was suffering under martial law, Andrzej Wajda directed what is now known as the Solidarity Antigone. The play was specifically designed to rally support for Lech Wales's Solidarity movement. And just to make sure that the audience actually got the point, Wajda dressed Antigone and the chorus in blue workers' uniforms, but he dressed Creon and his henchmen in the loud suits that were sort of preferred by mafia dons, just in case you didn't get it. More recently, again, Seamus Heaney, the Irish Nobel laureate, created another version of Antigone that he called Death in Thebes, which was designed to use the struggle between Antigone and Creon to highlight the problems and tensions that plagued Ireland in those years. I could go on. There are a lot of other examples, but I'm sure you get the point. Antigone's theater receipts over 2,000 years must have mounted up to a lot of money. But the real value of Sophocles' play is not monetary, it's moral. Right? And in his Nobel Prize acceptance speech, the American author William Faulkner claimed, he said, the past is never dead, it's not even past. And Antigone's timeless themes and its use to influence politics in modern era shows that Faulkner was certainly right. One more story. And I learned this one from Neil McGregor, director of the British Museum. And it starts in 1879 when archaeologist called Hormuz Rassam excavated an unusual object in what today is known as Iraq, but was once Babylon. It's about the size of a rugby ball, and it's made out of clay. It was cylindrical in shape, and it had ancient writing all over it, and it was about 2,500 years old. And the story goes back to the Old Testament prophet Daniel, and the night specifically of Belshazzar's feast. It's Belshazzar's, whose father had conquered Israel, destroyed the temple, and enslaved the Jews, threw a celebration bash. And it was a pretty wild night. People carried on, and they even drank from the temple's holy vessels. During the festivities, handwriting magically appeared on the wall, and it said, "You are weighed in the balance and found wanting, and your kingdom is handed over to the Persians." And that night, Cyrus, the king of the Persians, entered into Babylon, and Belshazzar and his family were history after that. That's Cyrus, as soon as he became king, issued a declaration to his new subjects, and he had it inscribed on a clay cylinder, the same one that was excavated by Rassam. It was kind of the world's very first press release. Here's my king, here I'm in charge, and I'm going to tell you what I'm going to do. What I'm going to do is, first of all, be king of the entire world. Only Boris Johnson has matched that, hasn't he? Cyrus vowed to govern in interests of everyone. Natural rights, he said, would be protected. Human rights would be protected. Political rights would be protected. And the exiled Jews, who Bob Marley reminded us would wept by the waters of Babylon when they remembered Zion, they were allowed to return to Jerusalem and to rebuild their temple. And Cyrus, on his son Darius, ruled over a huge multicultural kingdom for many years peacefully. Now, sometime later, Xenophon, who was a historian, wrote a book called Cyropedia. And in that book, he praised Cyrus as a defender of freedom, of human rights, and he listed all of the great deeds that Cyrus did to protect those rights. That book, the Cyropedia by Xenophon, found its way to the New World, and it was picked up by the founding fathers of the American Revolution, who all read it avidly and quoted from it quite often. Story was that Thomas Jefferson actually had 2 copies of it. And this is how Cyrus's enlightened ideas found their way into the American Constitution. Freedom of speech, freedom of religion, freedom of guns. 2 out of 3 ain't bad, that's what Meatloaf says anyway. But it was not just the Americans who valued Cyrus. When the Shah was reinstalled in Iran in 1941, he had these coins minted with his face on one side and the cylinder on the other in order to try to give himself some highly undeserved legitimacy. And the Cyrus cylinder was also used for celebratory medals when the State of Israel was founded, pretty much for the same reason. In 2010, the British Museum lent the Cyrus cylinder to Iran, and 500,000 people went to see it. And it provoked a fierce national debate about human rights and natural rights and the behavior of the Iranian government. Now, of course, the Cyrus cylinder makes money. It does. Right? People pay to see it. But again, money's not the value. The Cyrus symbol is a potent symbol of liberty. It has given hope to Jews, to Muslims, to Christians, to Americans, to Europeans, to Africans, and will continue to do so. So those are my 3. You'll be pleased to know that's all I've got. Those are my stories. And I want to sum up. And I can sum up pretty simply. We all owe a debt to the humanities, and that debt has been accumulating for thousands of years. That debt's not measured, like most debts, in dollars and cents. It's measured in ideas. Our form of government that we enjoy, our social institutions, our whole way of life rest on a foundation laid by the humanities. Now, of course, there are aspects of our history that we may regret. But that doesn't mean that we should ignore them or erase them or cancel them. What we should do is learn from them. Even grumpy old Karl Marx knew that. He said, and I'll quote him, "People make their own history, but they do not make it just as they please. They do not make it under circumstances chosen by themselves, but under circumstances transmitted from the past." Marx was wrong about a lot of things, maybe most things, but he was right about this. If we want to build a better future, we must first learn the ideas, good and bad, that brought us to where we are today. Preserving and transmitting our shared inheritance is the job of the humanities and the true value of the humanities. Thank you very much.